Hello, in this lecture we're going to talk about the concept of demand. Many people have seen this graph where we have a downward sloping demand curve and upward sloping supply curve. They meet in the middle, and that is a significant point. But very few people have really spent too much time with this graph, and there's really a lot involved in this graph, and it has a lot of implications in a lot of different areas. It's worth spending some time with, taking apart and looking at the pieces individually. That's what we will do here. We will start with the downward sloping demand curve at this time. So first, let's see the construction of the graph that we have. The vertical axis, the y-axis, is going to be price. So we're going to have price on the y-axis. It's obviously going to start from the bottom to the top. Conceptually, we're going to say price goes up. Sometimes we'll graph it. Oftentimes we'll just say as price goes up, what's going to happen. And on the horizontal axis, we're going to have the quantity demanded. So if we're talking about like tablets or phones or something like that, we're looking at the quantity demanded from left to right. It's going up from left to right. It's important that these are the only two factors that we are looking at when we're thinking about the downward sloping demand curve, price and quantity. Those are the only two things that are having an effect on one another. As price changes, what's going to be the effect on quantity? If we think about anything else that is affecting the quantity demanded or the price, then we're going to have to do something other than just having the demand curve. If we just have the demand curve, we're talking about this relationship between these factors, price and quantity. Then, of course, we have the downward sloping demand curve. Now, the downward sloping demand curve here could be representative of one individual's downward sloping demand curve, or like a market for phones or tablets downward sloping demand curve. It could be applied in a lot of different areas, and the concepts we'll talk about here can be applicable to an individual's demand curve or a market's demand curve. The basic concept, it will be an intuitive concept. That concept being that if we have price here, if we're starting at this price and we take it over to our demand curve and we look at the quantity, we would be at price 1 and quantity 1. So at this price and this quantity is where we would start at. If price went from P1 here up to P2, then we would then graph that over to our demand curve. What would then happen to quantity? It would go from Q1 down to Q2. So the concept, of course, is that as demand goes up, as price goes up, quantity demanded will then go down. And again, we can think of that intuitively if we're thinking about our own tablets. If we were thinking about buying tablets, if the price goes up, we might just buy one instead of multiple tablets for the entire family. And so intuitively, that makes sense. We'll define exactly why that is a downward sloping curve in more defined terms, but intuitively it makes sense that as price goes up, quantity demanded would go down, and vice versa. If we started at P2 up here at this price and this quantity, and price fell for whatever reason, then if we graph that over to our demand curve and then down to quantity, what happens to quantity? It goes up. That would make sense. If the price of a tablet goes down, then maybe we would be willing to buy multiple tablets and everybody have a tablet within the home. We could also see this graphic, and that would be something like if we had $50 price, maybe we have a quantity of 50. That would be this point here. If we had a $75 price, quantity 40. So at $75 price, quantity 40. At $100 price, price goes up to 100, quantity 30. At 125, quantity 20. At 150, quantity 10. And at 175, quantity is down to 0. We're not going to get into the slope of the line now. We'll talk about that later. But we're just trying to justify why it's a downward sloping curve at this point. So let's talk about why it's a downward sloping curve and through the income effect. The income effect means that the change in price affects the consumer's purchasing power. So if we're talking about apples now and the price of apples goes up, then the demand goes down. Intuitively, that makes sense. Why? Well, if I could afford 4 apples before and I was willing to pay this amount of money for 4 apples, maybe that amount of money can only pay for 3 apples now. The purchasing power of the dollar has gone down that we had in our pockets. We can't afford as many for the same price. That would lead to the idea of a downward sloping demand curve, in that as prices go up, the quantity would go down. That would be one justification, the income effect, justifying that downward sloping curve. Two other factors, however, that are going to be significant here. One is the diminishing marginal utility. That's going to be the idea that as consumption goes up, there's going to be decrease in desire or utility for each additional unit. That sounds a bit more abstract, but it makes sense once we look at an example. We would say if we had that first apple, let's say we had that first apple and we really want an apple, we would get a lot of utility from that. Now, what is utility? What is marginal? Marginal means the next unit. How much utility, how much happiness are we going to get from the next unit? Again, utility is another one of those terms hard to measure, but conceptually it makes sense that we would get more marginal utility from that first unit of apple than, say, the second unit of apple. After we consumed the first apple, we're probably pretty, done with appleness. But if we have another apple, we might have another apple, and we get more utility from that, but not as much on the margin. Not after we had already eaten the first one would we get the same amount of utility as we did on the first one. That utility then can be roughly reflected by price. So obviously if we get more utility or happiness from something, we're willing to pay a higher price. Price doesn't entail everything that the idea of utility entails, utility being total happiness from it, but price is an indicator of that. We would be willing to pay more for something that gives us a greater utility. The second unit then, we're willing to pay, we're not willing to pay as much for that utility, and of course so on and so on. As we consume more apples, we're willing to pay less, or we're getting less marginal utility with each next unit. One of the most extreme examples of this marginal utility concept would be is if we're dying of thirst in a desert and someone offered us one glass of water. That first glass of water, we'd probably pay anything we could for the first glass of water. As we get the next glass of water, we'd still probably pay a lot, but at some point in time, the glasses of water would be worth much less to us. That's one of the more extreme examples that is often given in this idea of marginal utility. Next reason or justification for the downward sloping demand curve is what's called the substitution effect. As prices go up for one good, that means that people are going to substitute for that good. So that's going to be the idea that, say, the price of apples goes up. Even if we really like apples, at some point we're going to say, apples are not the only fruit in the world. If the price of apple goes up a lot, we can always buy something like oranges. So the demand for oranges then might go up. We might buy oranges, substituting oranges for apples. Therefore, the demand for apples would go down. Again, what we're doing is justifying this downward sloping demand curve by saying there's a substitution effect. Most goods have other things that are kind of similar, that if the price goes up in one good, people will substitute for the other good. Therefore, as price goes up for a good, the demand for it will go down due to that substitution effect. Next concept we want to go over here is going to be the consumer surplus, the idea of the consumer surplus. So notice we have this downward sloping demand curve, and when we think about price, it's not like most vendors do not have a different price. They don't walk us down the demand curve. They have one particular price, either for the market or the individual. We can think of it in either way. But if we have this downward sloping curve, either for the market of apples or for the individual of apples, we can think that that first unit, we're going to say we would have been willing to pay this much because we had this much utility for it. We would have been willing to pay more for it. The price is only this much, and therefore the difference between those two is our consumer surplus in that case. We can also think of it as an entire market. We can say, hey, some people aren't willing to pay this much. There's a couple people that are, and for those people, they're getting a higher marginal utility. And then we could say, okay, for the second unit of apple for an individual, we would be willing to pay this price, and we got it for this price. So again, we can walk down the marginal utility there. If we're talking about the entire apple market, there's going to be a few more people willing to pay this price in the market, and some people that would not be willing to pay that price. For the people that would have paid that price but only had to pay this price, they have a consumer surplus. So the consumer surplus is the idea of what is being received by society, either the individual for their individual demand curve or for the market of, in this case, apples. How would we measure that? We can then take the area of this triangle. So the area of the triangle above the price and below the demand curve. If we take the area, that would give us the consumer surplus. How do we calculate the area? Well, that's going to be base times height divided by 2, or base times height times 1/2 the area of a triangle.